everybody. This is Sarah Wasberg Johnson, also known as the Food Historian, and welcome to episode 9 of the Food History Happy Hour. I'm going to give everybody a little bit to hop on. Sorry I'm a little late tonight, but our cocktail this evening is a little bit more involved, so I have a lot of stuff to get together. So we'll give it a second. I see one set of eyeballs is watching, which is fantastic. So it's Memorial Day weekend, which doesn't really feel like because a bunch of us have been from home for months now, which is sort of crazy to think about. But I thought tonight we would talk a little bit about Decoration Day and picnics. Since it is quite warm, it's supposed to be in the 80s next week, which I'm really not looking forward to. And then we could talk about historic food preservation and refrigerators and iceless refrigerators and fireless cookers. Hi, Rita, welcome. And we can make, hi Tiffany, we can make a rather complicated but hopefully very delicious cocktail tonight. So we're going to be largely in my favorite time period, which is the late 19th and early 20th century tonight. So I hope that's okay with everybody. And of course, as always, if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments as we go. But I think I'm going to go ahead and get started with tonight's cocktail. So tonight's cocktail comes from a 1906 bartender's guide called How to Mix Drinks. Very straightforward. And this one is called the Bishop. So it says to use a large glass, so I have a Collins glass here. It also calls for a wine glass as a measurement, so I have that here as well. And it's going to be very fruity. So let me just look at the measurements one last time. Okay, and we can go ahead and get started. Oh, I'm missing comments. Hello, Ashley and Carla. Welcome. All right, so as I said, tonight's cocktail is called the Bishop, and it requires a cocktail shaker. Sadly, I have very limited ice tonight. I went to go get ice cubes, and there were like 4 left in one tray, and there was 1 ice cube left in the other tray. So I gave my husband a little bit of grief about that I'm the one constantly refilling the ice cube trays. Hi, Anna Catherine. So I only have 5 ice cubes. So I'm going to put 2 ice cubes in the glass, because it calls for ice in the glass, and the other 3 in the cocktail shaker. And that is the end of my ice, which is too bad because it's kind of hot out. So as I said, we're making the Bishop. It calls for, we'll do it in order as it says, from 1906, it calls for a tablespoon of sugar. I have a feeling this is going to be fairly sweet. So we'll just get in here with the tablespoon. Take this out. Come on now. Tablespoon of sugar. And it calls for the juice of 1 lemon, which is usually, the juice of half a lemon, which is usually about a tablespoon. Try not to make a mess with this thing. Just likes to spit all over the place. And then it calls for the juice of half an orange, I'm pretty sure. Give me 1 second. Yes, half an orange. So I'm going to say, hi Eleanor. I'm going to say that that's 2 tablespoons. then it calls for half a wine glass of port wine. And I happen to have Brotherhood Ruby Port, which Heather, my friend Heather, who often watches this, I don't know if she's here now, but Heather recommended this to me. She brought it to a party and I fell in love. It's very good. Hi, Eleanor. I already opened it at a cork. I'm so glad I checked before we started the show. So I have a little pour here. So I'm going to do half a glass, which is going to be kind of a lot. Although this is not a very big wine glass. I'm going to say that's half a glass, because that seems like a lot of port. So in that goes. And then it calls for half a pony, which is half an ounce, so I have my little mini measure here. Half a pony of Jamaican rum, which is usually, I think, white rum. I didn't look it up, to be honest with you. So I'm going to do half an ounce, because a pony is 1 ounce. In that goes. And then we're going to give it a nice shake. Why are you leaking? Stop leaking. It's nice and cold. Okay, maybe this is too big of a glass. And then it says to garnish with fruit. So I happen to have a couple of blood oranges. So I'm going to pop a couple of them in there. And then we're going to be real fancy and do one of those. It looks so nice. Okay. So this is the Bishop, 1906, with some additional blood oranges in it. It is port wine, lemon juice, orange juice, sugar, and Jamaican rum with not enough ice, and now we're going to taste it. Wow, that is very sweet. Probably could have done without a whole tablespoon of sugar. I would not put that in next time, and I like my drink sweet. But otherwise, it's delightful because it has all the port wine in it, really good port wine. So, that's my beverage for the evening. What's everybody else up to lately? It's very sangria-ish, if anyone is wondering. Which I don't know why I didn't think of that when I found the recipe, but it definitely comes across as very sangria-y. Even looks kind of sangria-y. And I would make it again just without a whole tablespoon of sugar. But it is from 1906, when people were kind of obsessed with sugar, so. As I said earlier, it is Memorial Day weekend, which is a holiday that came out of the Civil War. It started as Decoration Day, first attributed to being first celebrated by freed enslaved people in Charleston, South Carolina. Anna Catherine says it's Drink Local Wine Night. How coincidental that I am drinking port wine from like literally 20 minutes from my house. Brotherhood Winery is one of the oldest wineries in the country. I think it is the oldest winery in the country, which is pretty good. Cool, their port wine is very good. I recommend it if you can find it. But anyway, going back to Decoration Day. Decoration Day was started after the Civil War, just after the Civil War, 1865, with freed black and enslaved people decorating the graves of, I believe, captured Union soldiers. So that's how it starts out. As the century wears on, it gets associated with picnics and picnic foods, because part of Decoration Day is you go to the cemetery and clean and decorate graves, which we don't really do anymore, even though that is technically still part of Memorial Day. Most people don't know that, or don't do that, or don't celebrate it. But even in the late 19th century, 10 years after the Civil War, people were picnicking in association with Decoration Day, which later became Memorial Day. And nowadays, we don't picnic quite as much. We tend to barbecue. Not in the Caribbean barbecue sense, but in like the 1950s hot dogs and hamburgers barbecue sense largely. But picnic food was definitely a thing in the 19th century. And the stereotypical late 19th and early 20th century picnic foods were usually fried chicken, cold sliced tongue or ham, cold salmon with mayonnaise, and then also all kinds of things like sandwiches and pickles and potato salad and sturdy cakes and cookies, not anything too delicate that we normally associate with picnic food. So people would pack a picnic lunch, go to the cemetery, clean and decorate the graves, and then spend the day picnicking in the cemetery, which they could do largely because most cemeteries by the end of the 19th century had been moved out of urban areas and into rural areas. It was called the rural cemetery movement. And it was a sanitary decision, right? Because people thought that urban cemeteries led to a lot of diseases. And it was also a way to have like a more beautiful final resting place, which is very important to Victorians who were kind of obsessed with death. Eleanor asked, what type of cake is a sturdy cake? Pound cake? Yes, pound cake was definitely on the list. Gingerbread, anything that usually either wasn't frosted or was kind of like just a single layer frosting, cupcakes, things like that. Cookies, again, sturdy, not very breakable, not necessarily frosted cookies like jumbles and ginger snaps and things like that. I did see one reference, I was looking in cookbooks for picnic foods, and I did see one reference to coconut cake, which I'm not sure if that's like the frosted coconut cake that we think of today or not, but frosted cakes usually don't hold up very well in the heat, and they're very sticky, right? So they're not necessarily great to be eating with your hands, which is what a lot of people did on picnics. I did read one account that said, although fried chicken is traditional, doing like little baby lamb chops or pork chops where you like trim the meat off the bone, so the bone is like a little handle, and then you bread them and fry them and then serve them cold. Like they were like, oh, it's so dainty and it keeps your hands clean. And fried chicken is also good, but according to this cookbook, it was much messier, which it is. So yeah, people would pack coolers. I did see one reference to bringing strawberry ice cream on a picnic in like 1910. So clearly they had packed that in some kind of insulated container. But of course, refrigeration, not really how it is now. So most foods when you see references to cold foods, they might be kept cool, but they're not really refrigerated like we think of like actually cold foods today. That just means that they're not hot, right? Often served at kind of like room temperature. So yeah, that's Decoration Day. I'm not planning anything special for this weekend. I'm just gonna take a rest, right? It's been a little cray couple of months, and I'm looking forward to kind of not doing anything. Maybe a little yard work, maybe a little book work if I feel like it. That's kind of the plan. Probably a lot of sleeping, although I think we're gonna have to put our air conditioners in this weekend because we do not have central air. So anyway, but speaking of refrigeration, I wanted to talk a little bit about that today because I think that's maybe not something that everybody is all that familiar with. But first I'm going to take some more sips of drink. It is very good, but it's quite strong with all the port wine in it, so it's going to take me a while to finish, I think. Yeah, very good, but very sweet. So, refrigeration really until the 1910s was almost exclusively provided by ice in insulated containers called ice boxes. So ice harvesting had been done in the wintertime. It would be packed in, on freshwater ponds or rivers or lakes. It would be packed in some kind of insulation, often like sawdust or straw. And then you'd get about 30 to 50% loss to melting by the time you needed it in the summer. But then you had ice for cooling food and also for making beverages in the summertime. At the turn of the century, you started to get pure manufactured ice, right? This is kind of in line with the Pure Food and Drug Act and a lot of concern about sanitation. And also our rivers and lakes were increasingly polluted at the end of the 19th century, both from sewage and other effluent pollution and also chemical pollution. So natural ice, which is harvested in the winter from freshwater rivers, lakes, and ponds, kind of declined in popularity as you started to get artificial ice, which was essentially drinking water that was frozen in large freezers using ammonia and other refrigerants. That started to become more popular, although it's not really until the 19 teens and 20s that starts to take over natural ice harvesting for ice box use, but you do start to see pure ice advertised a lot more for culinary and beverage use. So literally there were ice houses pretty much everywhere that they could be near metropolitan areas. In New York City, Rockland Lake was originally a huge ice production hub for New York City, and then also the Hudson River north of Newburgh, because Hudson River is a tidal estuary, so there's salt water that goes up to about Newburgh. So north of Newburgh there was ice harvesting to serve New York City and also other towns in the Hudson Valley. And also, of course, on big lakes like Lake Champlain, the Finger Lakes, places like that, they did a lot of ice harvesting as well. So the ice would be delivered, if you live far away from ice production or someplace like New York City, the ice would be delivered by barge. And then you had icemen with carts who would deliver giant blocks of ice to your house about once a week. They would come into your house and put it in your ice box, which is basically you would have the ice above an insulated storage area, and then the cold air and cold water would fall around this storage area and cool it. And then a lot of ice boxes had little spigots at the bottom for the cold water and to drain out all the melting ice. And then you could also order block ice to chip for either making ice cream or drinks or any other kind of thing you wanted chilled. So that was how people cooled their foods and beverages for over 100 years in the United States. It's not until we get electric refrigeration that really transitions away from natural ice. And as I found out in doing some research on railroad cars and railroad refrigeration, refrigerated railroad cars were refrigerated by ice until the 1940s, which surprised me considering by the time we get to the 1940s, most people have household electric refrigerators, but mechanical refrigeration on railroad cars is really not until after World War II, which surprised me. There was also during World War I, there was an ammonia shortage. Of course, it's used to make bombs and chemicals that you need for warfare. So there was a real push to get people to harvest ice again, and I think I posted on my blog a great propaganda poster about harvesting more natural ice to replace the artificial ice, which needed ammonia to be as a refrigerant to make artificial ice. So kind of an interesting little aside there. There's also some of the home economists from Cornell on one of their instruction trains talk about an iceless refrigerator, which I think was not the iceless refrigerators that were like being commercially manufactured, again using kind of dangerous chemical refrigerants, but using evaporation to cool foods. And I think I've mentioned on the show before that people would also use spring houses and well houses or wells to cool their foods. And if you were on a picnic, you would probably put, if you're near a body of water, especially a stream, you would put your beverages, and I've seen all kinds of references to like weighting watermelons so that they're under the water. And the running water, of course, is going to extract the heat out of whatever you're trying to keep cool, and keep it cool more so than still water, because still water you're going to heat up the water around you, but the running water is constantly moving, so it's going to keep things cool better. Same thing with spring houses. Spring houses often had running water in them, and they were usually built of stone or brick, so they were cooler. Root cellars. Sometimes people would suspend things down in wells, so if you could get under the frost line in most areas, once you get below a certain distance under the earth, it maintains kind of a constant temperature. I believe it's like 52 or 54 degrees. So that was another way to keep things cool before you had electric refrigeration. And the pricing differences between ice boxes and artificial refrigerators in the 19-teens and 20s was significant. Like you could get an ice box for like $30, and an iceless or chemical refrigerator or an electric refrigerator was like $500 to $1,000. So they were really for the wealthy early on, until electricity became much more prevalent, and then also the price went down, so that helped as well. So yeah, that's my little talk on early 20th century refrigeration. I could talk about, I have a couple of cookbooks, quite a few actually, from refrigerator companies, including Frigidaire, from the 1920s and 30s that sort of talk about the benefits of refrigeration. You start to get a lot of frozen things. When I was researching vintage salads, and I came across a community cookbook recipe for a salad that sounded really good, and it had like Roquefort cheese in it and all this stuff, and then it said, put in the freezer tray and freeze it, and I was like, let's not do that. You had me until you got to the frozen part. I don't want to eat a frozen salad, even if it does have blue cheese. Ooh, Maria asks, how do people preserve food if they didn't have preservation? Lots of salt. So people did have ice houses, especially if you were wealthy enough to own property that had freshwater ponds. And then in the 19th century, there were more commercial enterprises where you could buy ice from someone who harvested and stored it, insulated for the summer. But prior to canning, which was really kind of in its infancy in the United States, just prior to the American Civil War, yes, people would use salt. They would use smoke to preserve particularly meats, but salt and fermentation would preserve low acid fruits and vegetables. A lot of fruits were preserved either by drying, or I don't know if Neil's watching, but you could candy fruits, which means basically you infuse them all the way to the center with a sugar syrup, or you would make jam, things like that. And they weren't water bath can necessarily, but you would pour, you would either put buttered paper, greased paper on top to try and seal out the air. If you've ever seen really old cookbooks, you might see some references to sealing jams with paraffin wax, which again is to keep the oxygen out, because the oxygen is what promotes, what's the word I'm looking for? decay, I guess. Molding, all those things that you don't want. Let's see, we talked about salt, smoke, drying, sugar, fermentation. That's pretty much it. You would also get, if you've ever heard of potted meats, like potted pheasant or shrimp or things like that, that's where you cook a meat and then you seal it with fat, right? So again, you're keeping the oxygen out, which is what's going to make things spoil. And then also people had, I think, slightly lower standards of what was spoiled and what wasn't. Last time we talked about a lot about the Victorian obsession with game meats and hanging game and, you know, aging steak, right? Just letting it get old, and as it starts the first stages of decomposition, it sort of starts to break down the fibers in the meat, and that tenderizes them and adds flavor. I'm not a huge fan of of game meats in particular, although I do enjoy a good steak every once in a while. But yeah, that was a thing that they did. Yes, definitely no best by dates. I actually read something very interesting. It was talking about leftovers and repurposing leftovers and leftover food. And before people really understood germ theory, because of course until Louis Pasteur we thought most diseases were transmitted by bad air or miasma, right? So we didn't understand. Oh, hi Neil. We're just talking about game meats and aging and hanging things. We didn't understand germ theory, so leftovers also included the uneaten food on people's plates, or the partially eaten food on people's plates, which is kind of gross to think about now, but if you don't know about germs, you don't know that you can get sick from other people's food. I guess that was a thing that happened. I mean, maybe it's not such a big deal if you all live in the same family. I don't know, but that was surprising to me that leftovers included uneaten food on people's plates. I'm so glad we don't do that anymore, and I'm so glad we largely understand how germs work. Not everybody does, but yeah, definitely. And you know, I just posted a new book review. It's actually not that new. I did the book review like 3 months ago, but it just got published in Agricultural History Journal. I just posted it on my blog, and that is all about canning in the United States. And it's very interesting to read and kind of understand that early canning was super local and very regional, and you get a lot of small canning companies popping up, and they didn't necessarily perfect the science of canning at that point. So the food that you were maybe buying at the greengrocer or the dry goods store was not always of great quality and not always of great safety, I guess we could say. There's a lot of cans that would leak because they were sealed or soldered incorrectly. We started to learn about botulism, which is an extremely deadly bacteria that grows in environments where low acid foods are improperly canned. Low acid foods are fruits and vegetables that don't have acidic qualities. So like foods that can be safely water bath canned are, you know, most fruits. And then only a few vegetables like tomatoes, which are technically a fruit, but we eat them like as if they are vegetables. Yes, Neil also points out they would use lead solder in the tins, which could give you lead poisoning. So, you know, by the time we get to the 1920s, we've pretty much figured out safe canning, largely. Although there wasn't a whole lot of understanding, especially among household cooks, how to safely can to avoid botulism. And this is something that's discussed in this book, Canned, by Anna Zaini, I think is how you pronounce her last name. It's excellent. I recommend, if anybody wants to read it, you can. I've got a link on my website, and if you buy it, I get a little commission. But I definitely recommend it. And one of the things she talks about is how with all these incidents of botulism, ordinary housewives were like begging for information, like how do we can food safely. And canning companies were like not telling them. I don't know why, but there wasn't good information about how to can safely until really the 1930s and 40s, when basically we started to realize that you can't safely can low acid foods except in a pressure canner. So what a pressure canner does is it brings the temperature of the food above boiling point, above 212 degrees, and you have to get above boiling point to kill botulism bacteria. It can survive being boiled. So prior to widespread use of pressure canning for low acid vegetables, people would just boil them for hours. Like to can corn, you'd have to boil the corn for 6 to 8 hours straight, which is really difficult to keep water at constant boiling point for that long. It's also really hot. Like I can't even imagine boiling corn for 8 hours just so you can have canned corn, but that was a thing people did. Canned peas, same thing. So that was really why I think a lot of canning companies succeeded, because they were able to safely can foods that were difficult for housewives to can, like peas. Like peas were one of the first things that canning companies capitalized on, because they were very difficult to can safely at home. And also, if you boil peas for 8 hours, you're just gonna have like pea soup by the time you're done. And it was a very seasonal vegetable. It wasn't available year round like it is now. So that was also one of the first foods that is frozen for kind of the same reason. So yeah, brief history of canning. Neil is referring to something that I don't know what he's talking about. Talking about the terror, like in France. Is that from people going crazy from lead poisoning? I do know a couple of Arctic expeditions. I forget exactly who it was. Not Shackleton. He knew what he was doing. The other guy, I think. They brought canned food, and at a certain, they're stranded in the Arctic, and at a certain point, like, they find evidence of, they start leaving the camp, and they're taking, like, all these really weird, like, crazy things, and then, like, the drapes and stuff that you would not take if you were trying to escape somewhere. And one of the theories is that they all got lead poisoning from their canned foods and went crazy. So, don't eat lead, people. I'm now looking up to see what Neil is referring to. Oh, the ships! Yes, and it was Frank. Okay, thank you. So I kind of was right. I thought you were talking about the French terror, which doesn't make sense when I stop and think about it, because Napoleon is one of the people who helps make canning a thing, right? Although it's glass canning jars at first. We figure out tins later. So the other interesting thing, it's not really food preservation, but it is kind of like food technology, and that I wanted to talk about tonight, is the Fireless Cooker. And Catherine says, but lead salts are nice and sweet. They are. Maybe we'll have to talk about candy, poisonous candy next time, because they would use lead coloring in candies, right? Yeah, scary stuff. Anyway. But the Fireless Cooker is another kind of innovation that's mentioned by my little beloved home economists in World War I as a fuel saver. And a Fireless Cooker is basically a predecessor of our electric slow cooker. You bring food usually to a boil on a stovetop, and then you pack it in a Fireless Cooker, also sometimes called a hay box, right, which is just an insulated box. You could make your own out of a wooden box and blankets or hay or whatever kind of insulating material you could get. And then you cover it up, all insulated, and you let it sit. And if you put it in while the food is boiling, right, it'll continue to cook and gradually cool down, keep cooking all along. And then you can open it up several hours later and your food is cooked. So they were, I don't know how popular they were as a cooking method on the regular for people in the early 20th century. They definitely were a favorite of home economists because they were so frugal, and also because you don't have to watch your food. You don't have to keep the fire stoked in your cast iron range or gas range, so it saves gas. And Catherine is asking for a DIY hay box, maybe on a day where it's not so hot. Oh, and she says there's still a Nicholas Eppert, is that how you pronounce his last name? Award for contributions to food technology. That's kind of cool. Sweetie Pie wants in, apparently. You want to come in, Fluffy girl? Getting a visit from my little fluffy dog. Yeah, maybe we could do a hay box. It's probably not going to be insulated with hay. It's going to be blankets. But we could probably figure it out. I have some old blankets laying around. I would not use anything with plastic in it, like unless you need it on the outside. And there probably should be all natural fibers coming into contact with a hot pot full of boiling water, boiling whatever you're making. Although I have to wonder, it doesn't really say in any of the recipes what sort of cooking vessel to use, but I'm guessing that cast iron would probably be better than steel or tin or any other kind of vessel, because it would help hold the heat for a lot longer. So, alright, maybe next time I'll either do a little blog post or look up some recipes for fireless cookers and see what we come up with. Because, of course, for summertime cooking, I mean, you have to fire up the stove in the morning anyway, usually, but then you could put food in it and let the fire die down a little bit. You don't have to keep it stoked and let the food cook in there all day, and then you don't have to worry about it. So, you can see why they were a favorite of home economists. Yeah, there she goes. That's Sweetie Pie barking at my husband, who is leaving the house right now. So, anyway, that's pretty much all I had to talk about prepared for today. Does anybody else have any other? And Catherine posted a link to Mother Earth News, Rediscover Haybox Cooking. There you go. No, I don't have to do it. Somebody else already did it. But I can dig up some recipes. Wow, I think that's the first time I've talked for like 40 minutes straight, you guys. Does anybody else have any cool questions? I think I might have to look up the history of sangria for next time, since this is basically what this is. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm drinking the Bishop cocktail, which has port wine, rum, and citrus juices in it, and then called for a fruit garnish, so I made it pretty. Oh, Eleanor says it might be interesting to look at foods that were made for the Sabbath, because you can cook. So that is definitely, I haven't followed up that much with my class on Jewish food from the YIVO Institute, but one of the things they did talk about was cholent, right, which is a Sabbath dish, or Shabbat, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And that is one of the things that they mentioned in Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, is that everybody would carry their cholent pot to the village baker. So they would do all their bread baking, and this is true, people would do this in New England Puritan and Protestant communities too. You would fire up your bread oven, and how a bread oven or how a bake oven works is basically you build a fire inside the bake oven, and then you rake out, once it's nice and hot, you rake out the coals and you cook things in the bake oven in order of the heat that it needs, right? So the things that need really hot oven you do first, and then as the oven cools, you put things that need lower and lower heat. So, for instance, New England baked beans, you would put that in the bake oven last and close it, and it would cook basically all night, and then you would have, hot, hopefully still hot, beans the next morning, and it would be all cooked. And it's the same thing with cholent, right? You put the dish in the oven at the end of the day, right, before sundown, close it up, and it cooks the residual heat from the bake oven, cooks it overnight and all the next day, and then you have magical cooked dinner for the Sabbath, or Shabbat, or however you want to pronounce it, and you didn't have to do any labor on the day of rest in order to make the dinner because you did it all in advance. So yes, that is a very interesting point, and you could totally use the hay box that way. I think, I don't know if it would work overnight, but that's definitely how bake ovens were used since medieval times, really, whenever you have a communal baker, especially since a lot of people didn't have their own bake ovens necessarily. You did most of your cooking over an open fire. So your bread baker, you didn't necessarily bake your own bread if there was a bread baker that you purchased bread from. Like as a communal thing, I don't know, I don't think people had to pay for it, but everybody would bring their cholent or bean pot to the baker. He would put them all in, shut the door, and then everybody would go and get them when it was time for dinner the next day. So, yes, excellent point, Eleanor. Thank you for bringing it up. I will have to look and see if that plays into the hay box situation at all. I'm not sure that it does, but I will look it up and see what I can find. Does anybody else have any other questions? You guys are having great questions today. Anybody have any picnic foods planned for this weekend? I'm probably going to make herbed bean salad again because it's supposed to be hot. Brand new Patreon patron. Thank you, Connie. Connie fell in love with the herbed red bean salad, I think. That's also on my website. You can just use the little search bar to find it. So yeah, because it's, who wants to cook when it's this hot out? For dinner I made salmon salad, because I like to buy salmon instead of tuna because it's a little more sustainably harvested, especially when you get the extra nice expensive cans. And last time I went grocery shopping, I forgot to get any sort of sliced deli meat, so I didn't have anything for sandwiches, and I really didn't feel like hard boiling eggs. So I had a couple cans of salmon, so we made salmon salad, and tonight we had salmon salad melts, which was delicious. So also very spring, summer, Memorial Day-y, 4th of July food, salmon with peas and new potatoes. I almost made a strawberry drink, you guys, but it called for whiskey and I don't have any whiskey. Maybe I'll see if I can dig up something strawberry themed next time, since we are actually coming close to strawberry time in the Northeast. I think people usually underestimate how late strawberries actually ripen anywhere outside of California, Mexico, and Florida. Like, I was watching saw some post, and it was like an old magazine cover. It's probably one of like the illustration groups I'm in on Facebook, and it was the June issue, and it said something about spring on the cover, and people were like, what? June isn't spring. But in the Northeast, in terms of weather and gardening, yes, historically June was spring. I mean, I know everybody thinks that because it's got the summer solstice in it that it's summer, but not so much in the American Northeast. Certainly not this spring, although I think we've had like our week and a half of like 70-degree weather, you know, nice mid-60s, 70-degree weather, gorgeous. Yesterday was a gorgeous day, and next week it's going to be all hot, so we really just go from like winter to summer now, which I dislike because I like the shoulder seasons best. All right, any other questions? What else should we talk about? I don't have anything else good to talk about, you guys. I like exhausted on my topics. I've done like 0 bookwork this week. Although I'm hoping I have a fairly relaxing weekend ahead of me, and I've been catching up on sleep. So I'm hoping I'll have a little more energy to dive into some bookwork. Although I am debating, I found Oh, Len says our raspberries were starting to bloom last week. I'll have to go and see if they hang on. Yes, also, if anyone is interested in pollinators, apparently when blackberries and raspberries start to bloom is when you can mow your lawn, because there are other food sources. And I actually just ordered some calico aster and slender mountain mint seeds that I'm going to try and sow in my lawn so we can have pollinator food in the fall, because I'm super into native plants and supporting our pollinators, because without pollinators we won't have food. So, and also I really love watching the bees and bumblebees and stuff hanging out where the flowers are. So anyway, what was I talking about before we started talking about pollinators? I don't remember. Oh, right. So one of the things I discovered in my book research, which I'm not sure if it's going to fit in the book, I might have to make it like a separate thing, is I discovered a whole little treasure trove of information about soldiers' canteens in New York City in late summer and fall of 1918, including an African American only segregated soldiers' canteen in Harlem, which was operated by I think it was a city food committee. I'm blanking on the name right now, but I just thought that was fascinating. So the soldiers' canteens were like healthful, inexpensive food purveyors, largely of like sandwiches and coffee kind of places, staffed by volunteers for the most part, where soldiers could go and get a clean, healthy meal in like a nice atmosphere. And then often they would also have little information desk where they could maybe get free movie or Broadway show tickets, or get directions to inexpensive lodging. And the Harlem one actually had lodging on site, because of course trying to find a place to room as a black man, even a returning soldier, in 1918 was not easy in New York City, so they did have lodging on site for some of those soldiers. So all these interesting little side stories that I find, and I'm not always sure they fit in the book, which makes me a little bit sad sometimes, because I want everybody to be able to find out all the same stuff I know. But that's one of my dilemmas, to figure out if I can fit that in there or not. Len also says the holly has been covered with all sorts of bees, wasps, and flies. Oh, yes, Maria, in New York City, yes, they definitely had soldiers' canteens. But again, they're only open from August until November. I think most of them have Thanksgiving dinners, which is really sweet for returning soldiers. But I think most of them are closed by Christmas. But definitely soldiers were returning in waves. New York City was a primary transportation hub for all of our wartime actions in Europe. Soldiers shipped out from New York City and they came back in. It's basically the shortest route between the continental United States and France and England, so I think that's why. And also it's a huge port at that time. So yeah, Catherine says I'll just have to write another book. I might have to. Because I think, any historian will tell you, as soon as you finish some book or project or whatever and get it published, and you find a whole bunch more information that you're like, why didn't I put it in the book? Also, there's a ton of information at the National Archives and Records Administration on the official federally appointed food administrators for New York City and New York State. And then they all had food conservation agents and sub-food administrators under them. And I just don't think I'm going to get there before I need to finish the book, because the book would probably be twice as long, and at a certain point you just have to stop researching and get it done. And that's where I'm at. I have a couple more things to research, a couple more loose ends to tie up, and then I think it's got to be done, because it's been 5 years now, you guys, and it's just time to be done. It's still going to be awesome. It's still going to be great. But yes, I think probably what will happen is I will need to just write another book when it's done. But I found out about the canteens when I was doing research on New York City, which is a little bit, ironically, a little bit of a gap in my research to figure out more precisely what they did and when they did it and all that fun stuff. So, that's on my list. Farm cadets, farmerettes, New York City, and a little bit more about what New York State did. Although, I have to tell you guys, and that making me done when I went, oh no, I guess it's only 50 minutes, so we still have like 10 more minutes. I keep seeing things in the news that relate back to what happened in World War I. So like I just saw an article about Germany is, yes, Carla says I am already up to 300 pages. I mean, that's with images in there and footnotes. So take that, and double space, so take that a little bit with a little bit of grain of salt. But yeah, I'm like already up to 300 pages, and it's like 380 max as per my book contract. So I don't think I should go to the National Archives and Records Administration. That would probably be dangerous. Besides which, I'd have to take time off from work, and the pandemic has to be over, and I'd have to like pay my own way because I don't get a research stipend because I don't work for a university. So maybe someday I'll make it there. But anyway, what was I talking about? I don't remember, you guys. Writing another book? Somebody remind me what I was just talking about. I can't rewind, it's live! Too much wine, maybe. Getting down to the bottom. So yeah. Oh, I remember. Thank you, brain. I just saw a news article about Germany is having severe agricultural labor shortages because of coronavirus, which is also happening in the US, so I don't think we're quite where Germany is now. But that was something that happened during World War I. And that's why farm cadets and farmerettes sort of stepped up to fill in the gap, because farm labor and farmers were not exempt from the draft, despite lobbying efforts by farmers to make them exempt for the draft. They were not. So farm cadets, which is teenage boys, and farmerettes, which are largely middle class and upper class white women, young white women, like college age women, both kind of stepped in to fill the gap. Of course, we can't really do that in coronavirus, but I saw in Germany, they're like, because part of the reason why they have an agricultural shortage is because they have closed borders right now, which is probably also an issue that we are going to have, because most of our agricultural products that cannot be harvested by machine and need to be harvested by hand are harvested by people from Mexico and Central and South America, some of whom are here illegally, some of whom are here on special work visas. But because of coronavirus and our borders being shut, that is probably going to be a problem. And it's definitely a problem in Germany right now. But it's just another example of parallels between what's happening now and the past. And also on my list is to write an article about it. I did start, but man, that's like could be a whole other book at this point. Although I did see a little bit of incentive. There apparently is some sort of history article prize, cash prize for the best published article on history and our current coronavirus pandemic. And they're giving out $1,000 every week and a $5,000 grand prize. But the deadline is June 5th. So we'll see if I make it, but it's a little added bonus. Ooh, yes. Anna Catherine makes the point that Jamaican crews come up the East Coast too. Yes, crews from Jamaica and the Caribbean do also come up. Yeah, lots of people coming on work visas. What did I see? Some sort of article. Gosh, I'll have to see if I can dig it up about Jamaican agricultural laborers in the 1960s and like the sort of deal with the devil we figured out to have them come and do our labor but not have them stay, which I think is too bad. If you're good enough to work in the United States, you should be good enough to live in the United States, in my opinion. But that has not been how our policy has worked in the last 75-ish years. So, anyway, any other last questions for me before we are done with our food history happy hour? I've been blueberry plant shopping today, but I think I have to get my soil tested first. I don't think it's acidic enough for blueberries, but that's also on my gardening list. Any other questions for the remainder of the evening? For those of you who missed it, I am drinking the Bishop cocktail from a 1906 How to Make Cocktails guidebook. It has port wine and rum and citrus juice in it. And as Anna Catherine reminded me, our oenologist reminded me today, it's Drink Local Wine Day, which I did not know, but coincidentally, I'm drinking local Brotherhood Ruby Port, which I highly recommend. It is delicious. It's very fruity, and not like burningly strong like some fortified wines are. So yeah, got 4 minutes left, people. What else should we talk about? Well, so far on my list, I'm going to look up hay boxes. And those of you who did not hear me earlier when we were talking about canned food, I do have a new book review, a history book called Canned, which is about the history of canning in the United States with an emphasis on kind of the industrial corporate side of canning, not so much the home side of canning. Although definitely an article or a book on community canning and also community meat lockers is on my to-do list once the World War I book is done. Although, having done the Cooking by the Book program so many times now and seeing how it's so popular, that might be bumping everything else off the list once the World War I book is done. I think I might need to write a book about cookbooks in America. Oh, another book that you can check out as soon as I'm done reading it. I'll write a little more informal review for it, not for publication necessarily, but I am reading Jane Ziegelman and Andrew Coe's most recent book, which came out a couple years ago, called A Square Meal, which is a culinary history of the Great Depression, which I had bought probably a year ago and hadn't read it, and I was like, you know what, I need a break from World War I. Oh, just have a little friend. You can go over there, buddy. Little stink bug. Doesn't need to be on my drink. So it's a culinary history of the Great Depression. I thought I'll take a break from World War I and read about the Great Depression. I don't know as much about the Great Depression as I do about either of the World Wars. And funnily enough, like the first chapter and a half of the book is about the end of World War I and kind of the aftermath of the war on food policy, which is actually really useful for my book because my last chapter I actually decided to combine chapters 11 and 12, which is fine because I have a chapter 3.5. So I'll still have 12 chapters. I'm just rearranging a little bit. But chapters 11 and 12 are about what happens after armistice in terms of food in New York and kind of what happens to all of the historical characters we've met along the way. So in a lot of instances, we're going up to the Great Depression in some instances, and even further into World War II. My favorite fact, I think that's going to make it into the book, I think I mentioned this in my little monthly newsletter that I've started now, so if you're not on my email list, you should sign up, because not only do you get blog post updates as soon as they're posted, but I've also started doing a little monthly newsletter that I did a couple, gosh, is it just last week? I guess it's just last week. But a fun fact is that the Farm Cadet program under the Department of Labor in New York State, which was started during World War I, continued until 1982, which is not something that I thought I was going to discover, but I thought that that was pretty cool. So that's all going to go into my chapter that I'm calling Aftermath, right? What happens after the war. So coincidentally, this book I'm reading about the Great Depression ended up being very useful in kind of understanding what was happening after the war. It is extremely engagingly written. It's probably one of the most interesting straight up history books I've read in a while. It kind of sucked me right in. But it's very sparsely cited, which is driving me a little crazy. I think probably because it was intended as more of a trade style publication rather than academic publication. So there are citations, but usually only when there's a direct quote. So there's some statements that I wish I could look up, what evidence they're backing the statements up with, and I can't because they don't put in citations, which drives me a little crazy. But anyway, so that's what's on my plate, and we've been talking for an hour, so last call for questions. If anybody has any more questions. Hi, Ashley. I didn't say hi to you earlier. Takes me a minute to see your guys' comments, so I'll give it a couple seconds here to see if anybody else has any last questions. I do promise I am going to try and be better about posting these videos on my blog. I got kind of behind the last couple weeks and posted a bunch at once. I'm sure some of you on my email saw that. All right. Well, I think we're going to be done. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining tonight and for asking awesome questions. We made the Bishop cocktail, which is very similar to sangria. So I'm Sarah Wasbert Johnson, also known as a food historian. I am signing off from Food History Happy Hour, and we will see you next Friday at 8 o'clock right here on Facebook. All right? Thanks so much, everybody. Have a good night.